Cars are like hi-fi. It's the small and passion-fueled projects that are the ones that are truly responsible for the one-of-a-kind hardware. A giant conglomerate, purely because of its size, can never capture the sort of magic that the smaller marques can. And today's car represents the zenith of innovative, independent, automotive engineering. Hello and welcome to the Cars That Made Us, where today we'll be talking about the TVR Tuscan. The TVR Tuscan is a two-seater, front-engined, rear-wheel drive sports car that was made by TVR in Blackpool from 1999 to 2006. It came with a 4-litre straight-six engine, and despite the less than 2,000 of them being made, is one of history's most important sports cars. This car comes from Dan Kelly, who says, well, it's British. When it came out, it was one of the fastest things on the road. Comparable performance to a fast motorbike. It looks stunning. They're pretty rare sight. Goes like stink, sounds incredible, handles like a dream, and always draws positive attention and looks. So, where do we start with the TVR Tuscan? Well, TVR has 5 different eras, based off of who the owner of the company was at the time. The Tuscan that this video is about finds itself within the Peter Wheeler era of 1981 to 2004. To understand the most we can about the Tuscan, we've got to take a look at this era and what it brought to the table, and how the Tuscan managed to imprint its name into history. So, Peter Wheeler purchased the Blackpool-based marque in 1981. He made this purchase from Martin Lilly, who had to sell the company after a slew of poor sales numbers from the 1980 Tasman, as well as a fire at the factory in 1975, significantly harming production, as one could expect. Bear in mind that TVR is a very small company, so a fire at the factory is a matter of life and death, not only for the workers at the factory, but also just the company as a whole. On top of all of this, there were a bunch of emissions controls and a recession in the UK that meant that Lilly's hand was forced. He sold the company to Wheeler in 1981. One of the first things that Wheeler did after taking the helm was take the Tasman that began production in 1980, strip it of the 2.8-litre Ford V6 and replace it with a 3.5-litre Rover V8. Releasing it as the new TVR 350i that had critical acclaim. This was a very important first move for Wheeler, as this British Rover engine is one of the things that characterizes what makes TVR special to this day. A quintessentially British driver's car with an engaging and characterful drive that also has a brutality that really can't be found anywhere else. Following the release of a bunch of different variants of the 350i, colloquially known as the Wedge series, Wheeler turned his eye to creating an entry-level model, as larger power plants, more luxurious interiors, and more customer spec options meant that prices of the cars were on the up. In 1986, he unveiled the TVR S1, first of the S series. The S was a huge hit. Autocar, in October of 1987, said that the TVR S is critical to TVR's survival. Its nostalgic storytelling, low price, and superb dynamics guarantee a long waiting list. The S series very deliberately took design cues from the M series of the 1970s, as well as the 3000S. Not only did the S series fly off of shelves right until its end of production in 1994, but the success meant that Peter Wheeler not only had the trust of TVR fans, but also money in the bank to create new cars that fit his design. And it's from here that Wheeler's designs went stratospheric, and TVR went on a generational run. From 1990 came the Griffith. From 1992 came the Chimera. From 1996 came the Cerbera. And from 1999 came the Tuscan. While the Griffith, Chimera, and Cerbera got TVR to embrace curves again after the Wedge era, Wheeler took what was learnt from these models and unleashed designer Damien McTaggart to create what can only be described as a British masterpiece with the most seductive curves in existence. But before we look at the design, let's take a look at the engineering under the body. For the Tuscan, TVR developed their own straight-six engine in-house, aptly called the Speed 6. Although this actually wasn't the first engine designed wholly by TVR, as it was actually back in 1996 that they completed a V8 called the AJ-P8. The Mark I Tuscan had that Speed 6 4-litre straight-six engine. It had 360 brake horsepower at 7,000 RPM and had 310 pound-feet of torque at 5,250 RPM. It weighed an incredibly low 1,100 kilograms, which by the way was 290 kilograms less than the 911 993, which was the Porsche 911 at the time, and it had a top speed of over 180 miles an hour. There was also a 3.6-litre version at launch with 350 horsepower at 7,200 RPM and 290 pound-feet of torque at 5,500 RPM. One very noticeable characteristic of the Tuscan was that it had a much longer throttle than one may have initially expected, particularly compared to its predecessors. It had no ABS or traction control, so this is a really good way of ensuring the driver had control over the car. Although taking your head off has always been a classic convention of TVRs, and you'd be very much mistaken into thinking that this was not present on the Tuscan despite the longer throttle. A variant called the Red Rose followed the Mark I soon after it came out, which was itself soon followed by the now very sought after Tuscan S. The S was basically the standard car but with all the available options, such as the 400 brake horsepower Red Rose engine, larger brakes, air conditioning, a very close ratio gearbox, 18-inch alloy wheels and a boot spoiler, and front splitters and associated badging across the car to go with it. The close ratio gearbox is of particular magnificence because it meant the car could reach 62 miles an hour in just first gear. 62 in first! What? So cool. To those who are unfamiliar, like me before researching this video, the closeness of a gearbox ratio refers to how much or how little difference each gear ratio has. A gear ratio meaning how many times the crankshaft rotates for the wheels to complete one full rotation. So when a gearbox has narrow ratios, the amount of rotations of the crankshaft needed for a full rotation of the wheels for each gear is much more close. For example, Tuscans often operate most efficiently at between 6,400 and 6,800 RPM. So, as a result, when changing gears, the close ratio means that when you upshift or downshift, the revs will drop or rise nowhere near as much as they otherwise would, keeping the car within the range of revs that it is most comfortable in. This is advantageous because it keeps the engine in its ideal power band and keeps acceleration smooth and consistent. The alternative to this would be to have quite a wide gearing ratio, which would be preferable for long distance cruising at low revs, which of course is great for fuel economy, but of course not the best for a sports car. The Tuscan S also featured the TVR Hydra-Track system as standard. This was TVR's limited slip differential system. Okay, so all this talk about the engine, the engineering, and everything that went behind it and what went into it, what did this car sound like? Well, I'll let you listen for yourself. Exhaust notes are, I must say, distinctly British sounding. It sounds distinguished, but with this grumble and growl that you'd never expect a straight six to produce. It reminds me of somehow the Aston Martin V12 Vantage. Despite having half the amount of cylinders, I think it sounds better than a V12 Vantage, which is very impressive. It sounds unbelievable. But let's look at design. The Tuscan looks like nothing there ever was, and now that we're 25 years on, I think it's safe to say that there'll be nothing in the future that looks like it either. Cars of the time included the Lotus Esprit S4, the 911 993, and the Jaguar XK8, all of which have some curves to them, but none of which managed to capture just the uniqueness of the Tuscan. The Tuscan is at worst polarizing, but at best one of the most beautiful cars of all time. The car is curvy, but not in a way that was customary for the 90s and 2000s. The style and design is uniquely in belonging to the Tuscan. The individuality of the car extends far beyond the shape of the metal as well, because the Tuscan has never come in an ordinary color. The reflex paint option is by far my favorite. It looks beautiful, stunning. It's unlike anything else ever, and it suits that car perfectly. What particularly stands out for the Tuscan design, literally as well as figuratively, are the exhausts. Something I've learnt from slowly getting into bikes over the past few years is that a well-designed exhaust can steal the show. And this is a memo that Peter Wheeler clearly got. The exhausts on the Tuscan stand out. They make themselves known, not hiding underneath the body and only peeking out through it, or not hiding underneath where you don't even see the exhaust. It is a statement. And I am so happy it is a statement that Peter Wheeler decided to make. It also had a Porsche Targa-style roof that could come off for some open-top cruising. A convertible model was actually released for the Tuscan Mk2, but honestly, I can't see myself loving that because the soft top to me just sort of spoils the artwork. Although I imagine it is of course nice to take the roof off every once in a while, but I'd much rather have that Targa design. When speaking to Dan about the Tuscan, I said that it's the type of car you cannot have enough photos of, because every angle reveals something different. And the inside continues the curvature and the trend of the Tuscan doing things a certain way. The wheel is so stripped back, with a real 90s F1 feel. It has an in-house made LCD display and a brass instrument cluster that pushes this statement-making nature of the Tuscan forward. And you know what? I think it's one of the best 90s interiors ever. There aren't many interiors that have aged like this has. So what was the reception for this car when it first hit the market? Well, when it hit the market, the role of the Tuscan was never to outsell its competitors like Lotus or Porsche or AMG or BMW M, but rather to outperform them. It was to provide enthusiasts with a superior and more characterful package. It was never going to sell as much as whatever the competitors were providing, but it was released as a car that was going to find itself with a comparatively smaller but much more dedicated fan base. The Tuscan is an enthusiast's car that owners can be proud and perhaps a little smug of owning over something else. The Tuscan was remarked as being a tad more toned down compared to the untamed and undomesticated Sibera by journalists, with examples being the longer throttle but also a softened suspension. So the Tuscan's brutality had to be unleashed, rather than the car's vicious nature being something that you as the driver didn't really have a say in. One of the OG Tuscan's most contentious qualities was the very firm front end that behaved in a way that was quite at odds with the comparatively soft and grippy rear. The feeling was exacerbated when you consider the weighty but sharp power-assisted steering, which made this lack of unison much more apparent. Now, this was something that was fixed for the Red Rose and following models, But let's make it clear just how small of an issue this flaw in dynamics was. The Tuscan was, and still is, considered by enthusiasts and members of the automotive press as one of the best examples of a front-engine, rear-wheel drive sports car ever. The gear changes feel incredible. It's so lightweight and it's joyfully strips back and focuses on the quality and thrill of the drive, like the Lotus Elan. The engine has this heart-stopping power as well, but also produce this euphoric purr, which manages to inject you with adrenaline, but also just calm you at the same time. It's free-spirited, and like the other TVRs in existence, is in possession of an authenticity that really can't be found elsewhere. So what happened after the Tuscan? Well, the Tuscan 2. It was in production from 2004 to 2006. As well as sporting some revised design elements, the Mark II had small geometry changes, but also to improve dynamics, it featured different spring rates being the thing that determine how firmly and softly the suspension reacts to the road beneath it, new bump stops, which are responsible for cushioning the suspension if it bottoms out under pressure, and also had a very slightly lower steering rag, which is of course responsible for the translation of the turning of the wheel into the horizontal movements that are used by the steering linkage to turn the car. One standout version of the Tuscan was the GT spec. They made the Tuscan a race car, and it went to British GT, but it also went to Le Mans. It was called the T400R, and it actually has quite a story. So there were 7 race spec Tuscans that were made, and raced from 2001 to 2006. The first 3 being the Tuscan R, and the final 4 being known as the Tuscan T400R. And the T400R actually got a good few wins under its belt. It's a shame they didn't really manage to achieve too much at Le Mans, but I don't think the aim for TVR at Le Mans was never to win. It was just Peter Wheeler wanting to get that name back on the grandest endurance race in existence. So, in conclusion, what TVR managed to understand is that there isn't a need for conservatism when it comes to designing a sports car. You're allowed to make it fun, and because of the size of the company compared to their competitors, the brand has the privilege of going its own way with things like design, because there aren't boards of directors and stakeholders and international branches who need to be considered when making creative decisions. It's all down to one owner and his deep love and passion for the brand, wanting to keep the TVR DNA alive. TVR has a heart and soul that can only exist when projects stay small. So that is the TVR Tuscan, one of Britain's most important and the world's most important sports cars that, if you ask anyone in the motoring press or any enthusiast, they will love. Thank you for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you want to submit a car, just leave a comment or put something on my Instagram. Subscribe and like. People say that. So thank you for watching.